I joked about quitting for love and my boss said, "I'd rather you stay for me." The kind of man who makes you forget where you are. I have a rule about workplace crushes. Don't. Not because I'm particularly disciplined or because I've read enough HR memos to know better, though both of those things are true. It's because I've watched the slow-motion wreckage of office romances from a safe distance at the awkward Monday mornings, the divided lunch tables, the performance reviews that suddenly feel like cross-examinations. I've watched good friendships dissolve into something cold and professional after a weekend that changed everything. I made my rule young, kept it clean, and for 6 years at Harman Associates, I was proud of my record. Then they hired Daniel Voss. He came in on a Tuesday in late October, which felt wrong for someone like him. Tuesdays are for dental appointments and midweek slumps. They're not for men who walk into a room and quietly rearrange it. He was our new senior director of operations, my boss, technically, though the word boss felt almost quaint when applied to him. He had that specific kind of stillness that people mistake for arrogance until they realize it's actually just confidence so settled it no longer needs to announce itself. He shook my hand during the introductions, held eye contact for exactly the right amount of time, and said, "I've heard good things about your work, Ellie." I said, "Don't believe everything you hear." He smiled. Just one corner of his mouth. "I only believe the things I can verify." That was it. That was the moment I should have known I was in trouble. The thing about working closely with someone is that you learn their rhythms before you learn their reasons. By November, I knew that Daniel took his coffee black and his meetings standing up when he could manage it. I knew he arrived before anyone else and stayed after most. Not because he was grinding for appearances but because he genuinely seemed to prefer the office in its quieter form, humming computers, the distant sound of the city 30 floors below, the particular quality of light that came in through the west-facing windows around 4 in the afternoon. I knew he laughed rarely but completely, the kind of laugh that made you want to say funnier things. I also knew, in the way you know things you're trying not to know, that I looked forward to our daily check-ins in a way that had nothing to do with the quarterly projections we were supposedly discussing. My best friend Carmen diagnosed the situation over wine one Friday evening with all the clinical detachment of someone who had been waiting to say "I told you so" for years. "You have a work crush," she said. "I have a professional admiration." "Ellie, you just spent 11 minutes describing the way he organizes his desk. It's unusually methodical. It says something about Isa." 11 minutes. I drank my wine. She refilled it without being asked. We sat with the truth for a moment. "He's my boss," I finally said. "I know. And it's nothing. It's a blip. It'll pass. Rules exist for reasons, Carmen." "Sure." She tucked her legs underneath her on the couch. "Can I ask you something honestly?" "You always do." "Does he ever look at you the way you look at him?" I didn't answer. Which was, of course, an answer. December brought a project that required the two of us to spend an unreasonable amount of time in a shared conference room reviewing vendor contracts and restructuring operational timelines. It was exactly as dry as it sounds and somehow, inexplicably, the best 3 weeks of my professional life. Daniel had a way of making you feel like your thoughts mattered even when they complicated things. Most leaders I'd worked under wanted you to validate the conclusion they'd already reached. Daniel actually seemed to want to be challenged. He'd push back, then listen, then occasionally say "you're right" with the same easy steadiness he brought to everything. And there is, I discovered, something devastating about a powerful man who knows how to be wrong graciously. We started going to lunch. It was practical at first. We were deep in the project. There were things to discuss. It made sense to continue over sandwiches rather than break the momentum. Then it became less practical and more just lunch. An hour in the middle of the day that I caught myself planning around. We talked about the work, and then we talked about other things. Cities we'd lived in, books we'd abandoned halfway through, the particular loneliness of being good at a job that doesn't quite feel like yours. That last part slipped out from me on a Wednesday, over Thai food I was barely eating, and I immediately wished I could reel it back in. Daniel set down his fork. What would feel like yours? I don't know, I said. Something with more I don't know, stakes that feel personal. This doesn't. The company's stakes feel personal to you. They should. That's your job. For me it's more like, I searched for the word, borrowed urgency. I care because caring is what I do, not because the outcome touches anything real in me. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city moved in its usual indifferent rush. What touches something real in you? He asked. It was a simple question. It shouldn't have felt like anything. But the way he asked it, direct, unhurried, like he genuinely wanted to sit inside the answer with me, made my chest do something I didn't have a professional term for. I'll let you know when I figure it out, I said. He smiled. That half-corner thing. I'll be here. The joke happened at the company holiday party, which I had been dreading for the obvious reasons. Open bars and dim lighting are the traditional enemies of workplace professionalism, and I had come prepared with a firm internal schedule: arrive, make the rounds, compliment the catering, leave by 9. I was 3 glasses of wine off schedule when I ended up standing near the window with Daniel, watching the rest of the office attempt a choreographed activity that had been billed as team building and was in practice closer to controlled chaos. I might quit, I said, gesturing at a particularly ambitious colleague who was currently involved in what appeared to be a competitive wrapping paper situation. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Tonight specifically? In general, I've been thinking about it, which was true, in a vague, uncommitted way. My college roommate keeps sending me listings for a little bookshop in Vermont that's for sale. She thinks we should buy it together and just disappear into a quieter life. The great romantic escape, he said. Exactly. Leave all this behind for mountains and used paperbacks and someone who doesn't know what a vendor contract is. Someone, he repeated. There was something careful in the word. A theoretical someone. I looked out at the city lights. Hypothetically romantic. There was a pause. The kind of pause that has weight. I'd rather you stay, Daniel said. I turned to look at him. His expression was composed as always, but there was something underneath it that I couldn't quite name, something that seemed to require more effort than usual to keep in place. The project needs continuity, I offered. A perfectly reasonable thing to say. That's not what I meant. The noise of the party seemed to drop several decibels. Or maybe I just stopped hearing it. I became very aware of how close we were standing, of the particular quality of his attention, of the fact that Daniel Voss, who chose every word like it cost him something, had just said that's not what I meant, and was now looking at me with an expression I did not have a professional term for either. Daniela, I started. You should know, he said, and then he stopped himself, looked away briefly, jaw tightening, like a man who had just stepped to the edge of something and was reassessing the drop. You should know that the reason I'd rather you stay has nothing to do with vendor contracts. The party continued around us. Someone cheered. Music played. The city glittered 30 floors below, indifferent as ever. I thought about my rule. I thought about Carmen, who would absolutely say I told you so. I thought about the way he'd asked what touches something real in you with an unhurried patience that felt, in retrospect, like something more than professional interest. That's a complicated thing to say to someone, I told him. I know. He met my eyes again. I've been trying not to say it for about 8 weeks. 8 weeks. Since November. Since coffee and standing meetings and the corner of a smile that rearranged something in me I hadn't asked to have rearranged. My rule, I thought, was an excellent rule. My rule had served me very well. My rule was, at this precise moment, spectacularly unhelpful. I think, I said slowly, we should probably talk about this somewhere that isn't here. Something shifted in his expression, subtle, but there. Like a door opening just slightly, just enough to let in light. Yes, he said. I think we probably should. I joked about quitting for love, and my boss said, I'd rather you stay. For me. What stays and what changes? Honesty, it turns out, is easier with good wine and nowhere else to be. We stayed at that corner table for nearly 3 hours. The bar filled up around us and thinned out again, and we barely noticed. We talked the way people do when they've been practicing restraint for long enough that the release of it feels almost physically, carefully at first, then with increasing ease, the words finding their own momentum once the door was properly open. I told him about my rule. The whole history of it, the colleague at my first job whose marriage quietly fractured after an office affair that everyone knew about and no one discussed, the close friend who lost her best work relationship to a weekend that changed everything and couldn't be unchanged. I'd built my rule from other people's rubble, and I'd been proud of that. Proud of the clean, uncomplicated professional record I'd maintained. Daniel listened the way he always did, completely, without the restless energy of someone composing their response while you were still talking. "It's a good rule," he said when I finished. "I know. I had a version of it too. Mine was more about timing. I told myself there would be a right moment for things like this, a moment when the circumstances were cleaner, the complications fewer." He turned his wine glass slowly. "I've been waiting for that moment for most of my adult life. I'm starting to think it doesn't exist. The uncomplicated moment. It's a myth we tell ourselves so we don't have to risk anything." I thought about Maya and the bookshop and Gerald the cat who came with the property. I thought about borrowed urgency and the things that touched something real. "I think I've been waiting for it too," I said. "In more ways than one." He looked at me steadily. "The bookshop?" "The bookshop," I confirmed. "Or whatever the bookshop represents. Something that feels like mine. I keep circling it and not landing. What would it take to land? I don't know. Courage, maybe. The ability to tolerate uncertainty without needing to know the outcome first." I smiled faintly. "Which is ironic, given that I'm sitting here." "You're here," he said. "That's not nothing." "No," I agreed. "It's not nothing." We talked about the practical things too, because Daniel was constitutionally incapable of letting something important remain abstract, and because I respected him too much to pretend the practical things didn't matter. He was my direct supervisor. That was a real fact with real weight. If this became something and we were careful with that word, both of us, neither willing to define the shape of it yet, there would need to be structural changes. A conversation with HR. Possibly a reporting adjustment, which would require navigating office politics with more care than either of us particularly relished. "I want to be clear about something," Daniel said at one point. "I'm not asking you to accommodate this quietly. I won't put you in a position where you're managing the discomfort alone while I get to be the senior person who faces no consequences. That's not a thing most people say. It's a thing I mean." He held my gaze. "Whatever we figure out openly. Or we don't do it at all." I thought about all the versions of this conversation I'd imagined having over the past 2 weeks, other versions where I'd been guarded and careful and managed my way back to a safe distance. This wasn't that. This was something more exposed, and therefore, paradoxically, more solid. "Okay," I said. "Openly." He nodded once. Something in his shoulders released, barely perceptible, the way tension leaves a person who has been carrying it long enough they'd stopped noticing the weight. We didn't make any declarations that night. I want to be honest about the two. We didn't sit across a wine bar table and confess feelings in the full cinematic sense. What we did was more careful and more real. We acknowledged what was there, named it without overreaching, and agreed that it deserved to be handled with the same thoughtfulness we brought to everything else. It was, in its own way, entirely characteristic of both of us. He walked me to the corner where I'd catch my car home. The December air was sharp and the city was doing its glittering thing, indifferent and beautiful. "Thursday was a good idea," I said. "I have them occasionally." Daniel. Ellie? I laughed, which surprised me. He smiled at the full version this time, not just the corner, and I filed it away with the same helpless attention I'd been filing things away since October. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said. "You'll see me tomorrow." I got in my car. I texted Carmen 3 words, "It's something real." She replied with a voice memo that I didn't listen to until I got home, which was 45 seconds of her making sounds that I can only describe as victorious. What followed was not a straight line. I want to be clear about that because stories like this tend to imply that the conversation was the ending, that once two people are honest with each other the path forward arranges itself neatly. It doesn't work that way. What honesty actually gives you is a foundation, something true to stand on while you navigate everything else. In January, Daniel initiated a conversation with HR. I was not in that meeting, by design and mutual agreement, because Daniel had insisted on handling the procedural complexity himself first, and I had let him because his instinct for structure was better than mine and because it was, in a quiet way, a form of care I was learning to recognize and accept. The outcome was a reporting adjustment. I would move to a lateral position under a different director for project assignments while Daniel remained my administrative supervisor during a defined transition period. It was bureaucratically imperfect and humanly reasonable, and we both signed papers that felt oddly like the beginning of something rather than the management of something. My colleagues, to varying degrees, noticed. Some said nothing. Some said things sideways, a comment here, a loaded look there, the office equivalent of knowing. My friend Pryor took me to lunch and said simply, "He's different around you, you know." Lighter, and then changed the subject with a tact I didn't deserve but was grateful for. Marcus from accounting remained, throughout, blissfully focused on the Q1 budget. Carmen took full credit. I let her. In February, on a Saturday that had no particular significance except that we'd had a easy, unhurried afternoon that had turned into dinner and then into a long walk through a neighborhood neither of us lived in, Daniel took my hand. Not dramatically. Not with announcement. We were standing at a crosswalk waiting for the light, talking about something I can no longer remember, and he reached over and took my hand with the same settled ease he brought to everything, and held it, and the light changed and we kept walking. I thought about October. The Tuesday he arrived. The way a room can shift in composition without moving. "You're doing that thing," he said. "What thing?" "Where you go quiet because you're thinking something you haven't decided to say yet." I looked up at him. The city moved around us, the way it always did, the way it would keep doing regardless. "I was thinking about the bookshop," I said. He waited. Not as in escape anymore. More like here I searched for it. More like a thing that represents the version of me that knows what she wants and isn't waiting for the circumstances to get less complicated. And I think I'm becoming her, I said. Slowly. Late, maybe. But actually. He squeezed my hand once. Said nothing, because he understood when nothing was the right answer. We walked for another hour. The city glittered the way it does when you've stopped being afraid of it. I didn't quit for love. I want to be precise about that, because the joke that started all of this deserves an accurate ending. I didn't leave for the bookshop, didn't vanish into Vermont mountains with Maya and a cat named Gerald and a quieter life. Not yet, anyway. Maya is still sending listings. I'm still reading them with something closer to genuine consideration than I've ever managed before. What I did do was stop waiting for the uncomplicated moment. Stop borrowing urgency from things that didn't touch anything real and start paying attention to the things that did. Stop treating my own wants like variables to be managed rather than facts to be respected. What I also did was stay but differently. Not because it was safe, not because the circumstances were clean, not because I'd succeeded. I joked about quitting for love and my boss said, I'd rather you stay. For me, the space between saying